driving most virtual services to zero. And this is huge for the world. So to tee this up, the other tweet thread that we talked about in the chat, at least the one that I can't stop thinking about, is from Balaji last Saturday. And credit to Balaji, he's always one of the most provocative thinkers, sometimes right, sometimes wrong, sometimes 10 years early, but he's always provocative. And this one I think was just like spot on. And so Balaji's claim was with the release of DeepSeek and open source software in general, and I guess AI coding making the production of software continuing to get better, that basically it's going to drive the cost of models and most software production to zero. Cool. I think we all agree with that. Now, his claim, though, is that China is basically doing this strategically, that the release of DeepSeek basically is saying, look, the more we can drive the production cost to zero, what that does is, in the Joel Spolsky sense, commoditizes the complement. Commoditize the complement means, okay, cool. If we wipe out all of the value from the model itself and the ability to create software, well, then where do you actually make money? There's still an opportunity to make money. And the way you make money is by being the best at hardware.
And I think when DeepSeek launched that weekend, I think the next time markets open, I think like $1 trillion of big tech was knocked off, right?
Yeah, I mean, temporary.
Yeah, but it's like they saw that and like, whoa, okay, like something happened here.
It was an effective.
Our open source thing had a big impact on markets. Yeah,
an effective attack. Now, parallel of that with, some data points that I have been seeing just in my own sort of personal life and travels, which is that I think everyone, or at least everyone I know, is radically underestimating just how fucking good China is at building hardware cheaper, better, and faster. I always knew China was cheap, but I think now it's good. So data points there, on my last couple trips to Mexico, in the same way that if I call an Uber in the US, I'm always like, yes, I got a Tesla because a Tesla is a nice car. Smooth, it's electric. In Mexico, I got like, I don't know, quarter or third of my rides were all BYD, which is the big Chinese electric car manufacturing company. And every time I got a BYD, I was like, yes, it's a BYD. It's not 80% as good of a Tesla, but only costs $10,000.
Build your dream.
Build your dream. Or I think there's a bunch of variations. But the point is, it's cheap, it's nice, and China made the whole thing. And now you're starting to hear people say, well, actually, maybe China's way further ahead on the chip production than we thought they were. And so and by the way, on the energy topic where I'm getting really obsessed, they're the ones that have for years flooded the market with cheap solar cells. They're leading the way on battery technology. BYD just announced last week that they have a new battery charging technology where you can charge the whole car in less than 5 minutes. They're even beating Tesla on some of this tech stuff, which is crazy to me. So in that world where they commoditize the complement, software and models and AI goes to zero, China is in a position to win based on physical hardware, running the compute, and most critically, building and running the energy. Amazing. So then from the US perspective, you're like, well, what do we do? Like, we're just kind of like lazy compared to China, which is probably true. I thought we could kind of outcompete with free markets and creativity. Although interestingly, China's the one doing the free market stuff here, pushing with open source and winning on, actually having better margins and better products, while the US is trying to do regulatory capture, which is crazy to me. And so Balaji's then response is, he had two responses. He's like, how can the U.S., remain competitive? And the first one was
Bitcoin.
So why is he saying Bitcoin? I have some thoughts. I'm curious what you guys think of
that. I didn't see, these were like follow-ups. I think I saw the original tweet, but then I don't think this was a follow-up. He had two answers and one was Bitcoin.
His two answers were the U.S. needs to double down on Bitcoin and community. I have less thoughts on exactly what he means by community, but obviously Bitcoin's a very provocative one for this show.
Yeah. I mean, I think Bitcoin is, in a world where everything is changing and everything's changing fast and everything's competitive, there is no second best, right? So like Bitcoin is like the one and only, and there's not really a second best money. There's all kinds of other technology ideas. But if it is the one and only and it is the best, like it's some amount of certainty in a very uncertain world.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of natural that I mean, what else, historically you might have believed in like gold or real estate or something like that, but they all have problems with, they could be taxed in different ways and they could get confiscated in different ways. And like, Bitcoin is very unique in that it doesn't have those kinds of risks. And so it does seem like in a very uncertain world, there's actually more certainty in Bitcoin than almost anything else. I mean, I always think of Bitcoin as just like this fundamental truth about how people collaborate. And it is the only thing that you really can study and understand truth about, right? It's truth about how people collaborate, but it's almost to the extent that it's like a law of physics in the kind of truth that it has.
You've said not corruptible before too, and I think that's like nice, succinct framing. I didn't understand though how that's an answer for the United States.
Well, the way I think about it, and it's a little bit sad, and I hope he's not entirely right on this, because then it's like, well, we can kind of only win on this like finance or like financial innovation in a way, which is kind of what the US has done, I guess, in hollowing out all like manufacturing or whatever in the last 50, 60, 70 years. But I think the argument is basically like, look, anything that we create, China can fast follow, and they can do it really, really well and operate it cheaper. And so if software and digital stuff goes to zero, and they can like just trounce us on hardware. I hope that's not true. I mean, we still have Elon, and like I watched his all hands with Tesla and just came away so bullish again on that company.
And we don't know what happens with like robotics manufacturing. It might be that we took this 50 years off being good at manufacturing, but like that old style manufacturing isn't really going to matter 10 years from now.
Totally. And one can hope that happens, and like, you know, we push for that. But there's no arguing that China's like, they're killing it at manufacturing, right? And so then the kind of question is like, well, where does the US remain, maintain an edge? One possibility is basically just to embrace Bitcoin as much as possible, stock as much Bitcoin as humanly possible on the US balance sheet, encourage companies to do the same. It's kind of already happening a little bit, and potentially open free markets using Bitcoin. I think both are potentially interesting. Just like the pure financial play is like, look, Bitcoin, we think is going to be the currency of the next century. It's, as I've said many, many times, it's energy-backed money. It's incorruptible. It obeys the laws of physics. And so if we have an advantage to just basically stack before China can, and we think a lot of value creation basically accrues to the money itself, at least in this adoption phase over the next decade, then we basically just like kind of win by, being a little bit like Switzerland. We just like stuff the coffers, and it's like, all right, you guys do all the work, but we got the money.
I wouldn't take, I feel like that's a very negative framing of the thing.
Agreed.
And I think there's also very positive or optimistic ways to think about it. So like, if you can do things, if there's abundance in everything, and you can actually, everybody can have manufacturing, and energy is very easily accessible by everybody, and everybody has more than anything that they want, like their wildest dreams are fulfilled, then it's kind of reasonable to say like, well, look, we're just going to hold Bitcoin, and that's like, we're going to do what we want and be creative and hang in communities if that's what we want. We're just going to hold Bitcoin because that's fine. And like, I think there's like a little bit of a, like, we're a little bit old, and we have this like moral judgment of like, you haven't contributed the right way or something, right? Like maybe there's other ways that you'll find to contribute that are more like orchestrating creativity, and it doesn't have to be like, the industrial age, like nose to the grindstone kind of
Be there,
and
7 days a week.
So maybe it's like, fine, I'm going to hold Bitcoin and do creative things and family and community. And like, that might be just like, the future may just look like that. And we just don't really know how to be comfortable with that as like you have maybe some like moral misgivings from kind of the world that you kind of grew up in or know today.
Totally. We all grew up sort of Puritan West, and like, I totally buy that. And to be clear, the argument that we're making here is that if, the marginal cost, like basically of like, if you're not making money doing things, whatever value there is flows into the monetary system itself. So like if you think about Bitcoin, the one way I think about it is it's GDP coin. It literally just tracks global GDP. Yeah. Now we're in the early adoption phase. We probably have a couple more orders of magnitude before it reaches stabilization. But at some point, if global quote unquote GDP production is 2% a year or 10% a year, whatever, that's what Bitcoin in theory should go up as. So I agree. And there is a lot of morals tied around that. I do think there's a second also, where there's still, at least in this transition phase, more traditional business, competitive sense in the world that is a little bit more optimistic as well. And the optimism for me is that Bitcoin, in addition to being energy-backed money, it also represents what in theory was the biggest American ideal, which was openness, free markets, just freedom in general. And so it's somewhat ironic that China, by open sourcing things and actually embracing competition, has in some ways become the more free market country, while the US has become a lot more sort of, sadly, authoritarian over the years. But at the end of the day, there's still a reason Chinese billionaires are trying to leave there and live in the United States. Like the US still has a lot of incredible freedom left. We still have the Constitution. In the case that, China still has to censor the models with things like Tiananmen Square or whatever, like the US still is not doing that. So that there is some edge there. If the US were to lean all the way in, not just to stacking coins, but to embracing Bitcoin as a way to, 10,000x the kinds of apps and markets that we can reach and become a global leader in global markets again, that's a game that potentially China just might not play. Because even if they see all this unfolding, it may just be in the same way we talked about, Kagi is competing with Google by just doing something Google won't do right now, which is, hey, we're not doing ads. We're just doing paid search. And so that's how a startup can kind of attack a company that's got incredible market dominance. It might be the case that China ultimately is like, look, we're just never going to embrace Bitcoin. because we want control, and like free markets is ultimately antithetical.
Well, I mean, there's also like, what are the motivations of people? Like the leaders of these countries are they want to be recognized as leaders who've led the people to accomplish something, and that same sense of accomplishment may disappear when robots do everything. You know, so I don't know what time frame is that. 40 years, 50 years, 100 years, or is it like 10 or 20? I don't know.
Yeah, I think